Hello, Rob. We're back with The Haunted Homestead by Mrs. Emma Den Eden Southworth. It must have been the attraction of antagonism that united the hearts of this dark and somber man of 30 and this laughing, careless girl of 19, for it is said that they were greatly attached to each other. At all events, after a brief courtship and a briefer engagement, they were married, and when Mr. Van der Vaan proposed to her, as he had to his first wife, that they should emigrate to the West, she, in her gay, adventurous love of novelty, eagerly assented, notwithstanding that, to go with him thither, she must leave her parents, brothers, and sisters. Once more the property came into the market, and my father, seeing the advertisement, and desiring to remove to Virginia, opened a correspondence with the proprietor, then made a visit of inspection, and finally became the purchaser of the estates. When the transfer was about to be made, my father, pointing to the family graveyard, inquired of Mr. Van der Vaan whether he did not feel an unwillingness to sell that piece of ground, and told him that he might readily make an exception of that plot and retain it in his own right. But Mr. Van der Vaan replied that he did not really care to own a foot of ground on the estate. My father then told him that if he would like to retain the graveyard, it should make no difference in the price of the whole, already agreed upon for my father, you see. Alice felt a sort of hesitation in buying the place without exempting the bones of the old family from the purchase. But Mr. Van der Vaan had no scruples of the sort. No, he said, Mr. Laguerre, if I were to retain possession of the graveyard, I and my heirs after me would own an acre of ground in the very midst of your estate, which, as it stands now, might make no difference. So I shall never return to claim it, and could make no use of it if I did, but which might embarrass you very much should you ever wish to sell the property. That was good reasoning enough, I suppose, and at all events the sale was completed without the exception. We moved into the house, and Mr. Van der Vaan and his bride departed for Kansas. And he really, when he might just as easily have avoided it, sold the bones of his wife and her ancestors to a stranger. Even so, my dear Agnes, and believe me that we all felt as much shocked as you looked. But, said I, fixing my eyes upon her face, where the flickering firelight made the shadows play, the stranger has not been able to retain the peaceable possession of his purchase. What? What mean you, Agnes? Exclaimed Mathilde in alarm. I mean that the late proud lady of Wolfbrake still carries the keys and unlocks doors at will. Heavens, do you know that? I know much more than that. I know the portrait that performed the humiliating office or fire screen in the next room is the likeness of the haughty Madeline Van der Vaan. I know, beside, what more do you know? That our travelers have arrived, I said, as the sound of footsteps and voices at the hall door fell upon my ear. It was true. We were interrupted. As if borne on the wings of love, the slow old stagecoach was so much earlier that evening that our friends arrived an hour earlier than we had expected them, while Mrs. Laguerre was still superintending the arrangement of her supper table, and Mr. Laguerre was grating nutmeg over his huge bowl of eggnog, so there was no one to welcome the visitors except Mathilde and myself. As they entered the parlor, we arose and advanced to meet them. Mathilde, Miss Laguerre, can it be possible? This is indeed a joyous surprise, exclaimed Frank Howard as he recognized his lady love, and with an eager smile extended his hand, while my brother, without ceremony, embraced me cordially. I thought you knew to whom you were coming, said Mathilde with simple candor. No, I scarcely dared to hope for such happiness. Hey, Day. Hello, do you know anybody here, Frank? Exclaimed my wild and thoughtless brother. But before Mr. Howard had time to answer, I pinched Jack's arm, turned him around, and presented him to Miss Laguerre. The refined and elegant presence of Mathilde immediately brought my rude cadet to order. and he gracefully expressed the pleasure and honor he felt in being permitted to make her acquaintance. Miss Laguerre welcomed my brother with more cordiality than she had bestowed upon her lover, and I turned to receive Frank Howard's offered hand, and responded to his expressions of satisfaction at the present opportunity of renewing our acquaintance. When these rather commonplace ceremonies were over, Miss Laguerre invited her guests to be seated, and we resumed our chairs. A deep blush settled upon the beautiful face of Mathilde, but whatever might have been the emotions of Mr. Howard, he suppressed them through that repugnant self-control that ever distinguished his manners. And he was the first to perceive the entrance of Mr. and Mrs. Laguerre, and to arise and advance to receive them. My brother presented Mr. Howard to Mr. Laguerre, who received him with cordial politeness, and in his turn introduced him to Mrs. Laguerre, who smilingly welcomed him to Virginia. Certainly Howard had nothing to complain of in his reception. There was not the slightest lack of respect and kindness, and not the least overdoing of ceremony, which would have been still more offensive. All was natural and genial, as if there had not only existed a strong hostility to Frank Howard, the machinist. I was charmed at the manner with which my dear host and hostess completely overcame their prejudices, or at least suppressed them, and treated Mr. Howard in all respects as an honored and welcomed guest. And did this assuredly not in the spirit of hypocrisy, but of hospitality, as they understood its requirements. Soon Rachel Knowles and the other young persons of the Christmas party came in, were introduced, seated, and conversation became general and free. This afforded me the coveted opportunity of having a moment's talk aside with my brother. "Johnny, tell me now, and tell me quietly, or quickly and truly, was there any design on you or your friend's part to get him invited here?" "Design? Bless you, no," replied my brother, opening wide his great gray eyes. I thought not, for if the truth must be told, honest Johnny was anything but a diplomat. Well, there was no conscious maneuvering on your part, but there was not on his. Why, bless you, no. Why should there have been? Why should there have been? Oh, Johnny, where are your perceptive faculties? You will never be wide awake enough for a soldier. I don't know I don't know what you would be at. I suppose not, but did you observe nothing interesting in the meeting between Mr. Howard and Mrs. Laguerre? Woo, 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 woo. Is that it? Yes. That's what you meant when you pinched my arm black and blue? Yes. A sorry dog. He never hinted one word about this to me. He had no right to do so, nor must you speak of it. Why? Because, but I had better tell you all about it. They met about 3 years ago for the first time. It was at Saratoga, where he was making quite a figure. The acquaintance had ripened to friendship and something more when Papa bethought himself to inquire who this very distinguished-looking gentleman might be at home among his own people, and was informed that he was a machinist by trade. Recall to mind the passion of Desdemonia's proud patrician pa on discovering that he had a blackamoor for a son-in-law, and you may be able remotely to conceive the consternation of Mr. Laguerre. He hurried his family away from Saratoga and forbid the name of Howard to be mentioned in his presence. The lovers never corresponded and never met until this evening. You may judge how much cause for speculation there is in this meeting. Yes, but within these 3 years, great changes have taken place. Mr. Howard is a distinguished man, a man of fortune, and of acknowledged talent. One of the, what's it say, new givers? Raw givers? What does it say? Raw givers? I don't know what a raw giver is. Raw givers of the nation. And Mr. Laguerre and his family are reduced from wealth to a moderate competency. Yes, I know, but that does not change the old aristocrat's manner of regarding the affair. He contends that a gentleman born is always a gentleman, and a peasant always a peasant, notwithstanding the vicissitudes of fortune that may enrich the one and impoverish the other. Or rather, he contended so. It belongs to the past tense. Look at him now. See what deference he pays to Mr. Howard's opinion. The more politeness of the host, take nothing for granted from that. Nay, but Frank Howard is a gentleman of whom any father might be proud as a son-in-law. Very likely, but Mr. Laguerre is not any father. However, what I wish to know is, whether Frank Howard did not use you to procure the bid that brought him hither. No, indeed. How came it then, you artful boy, that you just the course, and the only course by which you could procure him an invitation? I don't understand you. You innocent. How came it then that you wrote to Mr. Laguerre? You would be very happy to obey his summons and spend the holidays at Wolfbreak, but that you had a friend with whom you could not leave, and whom you took care to not mention by name. Oh, because I never gave the matter a moment's thought. When I got Mr. Laguerre's letter, I just sat down and answered it right off and mentioned my friend merely as my friend. If I had, as you seem to think, been fishing for an invitation for him also, I certainly should have mentioned him by name and title as the Honorable Frank Howard of Massachusetts, etc., etc., etc. In which case you certainly would not have been invited to bring him here. Probably not, but I did not know that. What knew I of the hostility or even the acquaintance between the parties? I acted only in simple honesty. The best way to act, my dear Johnny, and so blundered into helping the lovers. Not so. You were providentially led. Well, as soon as ever I received the invitation, I hastened to write and give the name of my friend to our host, as I should have done at first if I had dreamed of his being invited to accompany me. And as for Frank Howard, he was as innocent of design as myself. He knew nothing about the matter until I showed him Mr. Laguerre's last letter, and pressed him to go with me. He then asked me if Mr. Laguerre was any relation of the Laguerres of Louisiana. I said I believed he had brothers in Louisiana, but I was not certain, as I knew very little of the family. Then he told me that he had the pleasure of meeting a Mr. Laguerre of Louisiana at Saratoga, and should feel happy in making the acquaintance of any of his family. And there the conversation stopped. Frank was evidently as much astonished as delighted at the unexpected meeting with his lady love. I am glad to know it, said I. And then, not to continue the rudeness of an aside conversation, I took my brother to Rachel Knowles, and left him with her while I joined my kind old host. Supper was soon after announced, and we were all marshaled into the dining room, where a sumptuous feast was spread, over which we lingered, eating and drinking, with Epicurean leisure, and talking and laughing for more than an hour. I said we, but I should rather say they, for I could not eat or talk or laugh. At last the long-drawn meal came to an end. The company adjourned to the drawing room, and an hour was passed in pleasant conversation, and then, in consideration of the fatigue of the newly arrived guests, we separated for the night. In the hall I noticed a diminutive page of the African race who rejoiced in the chivalric name of Emmanuel Philibert, which was adapted to daily and popular use by the abbreviative of Flit. Flit was standing and solemnly holding a light in one hand and a boot jack in the other, waiting to attend the two gentlemen to their bedroom. But Mr. Laguerre took upon himself the office of groom of the chambers, and accompanied his latest guests to their apartment. Rachel Knowles and myself reached ours about the same time. We heard the voice of Mr. Laguerre taking leave of the gentlemen for the night. We heard him and the little waiter Flit go downstairs and out at the hall door, fastening it after them. I will take care that this is secured tonight, said Rachel, going and carefully locking our door, and then trying to be sure that it was fast. That will do, she said, when she had satisfied herself of its security. Then, as we were very weary, we prepared to retire. We were soon in bed. Rachel was soon asleep. Not so myself. I lay perfectly still, almost breathless, waiting the developments of the night. And, reader, it was while lying thus wide awake and gazing straight out through the window to the spot where the family tombstones gleamed white and spectral in the moonlight among the dark firs that my ear was struck by the click of the recoiling lock, and turning I saw the door swing slowly open, and my dark-robed midnight visitant enter. Though wide awake as at this moment, I was deprived by excess of awe of the power of speech or motion. Slowly the spectre advanced and stood as before, pointing to the dark red spot hid beneath the carpet under her feet. I essayed once more to speak to her, but such terrors as her presence had never before inspired froze my utterance. I listened, wondering if my companion in the other bed was conscious of this supernatural presence in the room, but the deep and regular breathing of Rachel assured me that she was sleeping soundly, the deep sleep of fatigue. And all this while the black-robed woman stood holding my eyes with her fixed and burning gaze, and pointing to the spot on the floor. Then letting her arm fall slowly to her side, she passed, in measured steps, from the room and through the door that swung to gradually and closed behind her. Again I essayed to cry out, but the spell was still upon me, and no sound escaped my paralyzed lips. While lying thus, I heard once more the recoiling click of a lock, and the swing of a door upon its hinges, but this time it was not our own, but another door, that of the opposite chamber where my brother and his friend slept. "Who's there?" I heard John call out in no pleasant voice, and seeming evidently annoyed at the disturbance. There was no answer. "Who's there?" he repeated. No answer. "Who's there?" Continued silence. "Flit?" No reply. "Flit?" No reply. "Flit?" Dead silence. "Jet, is that you?" The silence of the grave continued, until at last the calling of my brother awoke his companion in the other bed. "What is the matter, John?" I heard him ask. "Why, someone has unlocked our door and entered, and I can't make them speak. But shoot me if I don't find them out." And my brother, jumping out of bed and beginning to strike a light. "You have been dreaming." "Have I? Look there, then." "Well, I see the door is open, but you probably forgot to lock it." "I'll make sure of it now, then," said John, banging the door violently, locking it with a resonant force and proceeding to search for the supposed intruder. Of course, the search was fruitless, and with many grumbles and threats he went back to bed. My brother had not seen the supernatural visitant to his room, who, go where she might, appeared only to me. While turning these things over in my mind again, I heard John's lock turn, and his door swing open, and almost simultaneously his voice called out, "What the demon does this mean? Who are you, then?" As he jumped out of bed, relocked the door, struck a light, and proceeded once more vainly to examine the room. "Well, this is certainly the most inexplicable thing I ever knew in my life," exclaimed John, with an intonation between astonishment and indignation. "Oh, I really suppose you did not lock the door properly," replied Howard, getting up and going to ascertain the state of the case, and I heard him unlock and lock the door several times, and finally locking it fast, he said, "Should I hold off here?" No. "There, now I will guarantee that it will stay shut." I do not think that more than 15 minutes had passed before I heard for the third time their lock fly back and their door swing open. "By Jupiter, this is past belief," exclaimed Mr. Howard, while my brother, without speaking, jumped out of bed and struck a light. They searched the room. They came out thence and searched the hall. They went up into the garret and searched the rooms over our heads. And finding no one, they returned, wondering and conjecturing, to their chamber, and for the third time that night fast locked their door. "Take the key out, John," said Mr. Howard, and John withdrew the key and took it to bed with him. About 15 minutes more passed, and then click flew the lock. Open swung the door, and out of the bed jumped John in a state of mind between affright and rage. "John, never mind. It is clear that the door will not remain closed. Leave it open. Tomorrow I will look at the lock and see what is amiss," said Mr. Howard. and for the fourth time that night I heard my brother muttering like distant thunder, go back to his bed. But I do not think that he slept that night, and I am sure that I did not. In the morning I felt weary and certain that if this mysterious visitation continued, I should go mad. As I was dressing before the toilet mirror, the reflection of my own face in the glass startled and terrified me. It looked so pale, wild, and haggard, and not unlike the awful face of the midnight spectre. When Rachel and myself were dressed and ready to go down, I opened the door. And just at that moment, my brother and Mr. Howard came out of their chamber and bade us good morning. Were you at our door last night, Agnes? John asked me. At your door, John? Certainly not. Wasn't you, though? Assuredly not. What should have brought me there? Well, somebody was, that's all, said my brother, while Mr. Howard silently looked what he did not say. I don't know what that means. Well, Mr. Howard silently looked what he did not say. We all went down together to the parlor where a fine fire was burning, and Matilda in her fresh morning beauty waited to welcome us. And soon our host and hostess entered, and in a few moments the breakfast was announced, and we all adjourned to the table. Breakfast was served long before the usual hour, that the gentlemen of our party might make an early start upon the fox hunt that Mr. Laguerre had arranged for that day. While we were still at the table, Mrs. Laguerre bethought herself to hope that the gentleman had rested well, when my brusque and thoughtless brother John said, No, indeed, my dear madam, we were fash with a boggle all night long. Sir, he means, madam, that we could not by any means keep our door locked, and had finally to give up the attempt, explained Mr. Howard. A deathly paleness overspread Mrs. Laguerre's face. I knew she regretted the question that she had been tempted to ask, and now she receded from the subject. Mr. Laguerre, who had kept his eyes averted and turned a deaf ear to the disclosure, now adroitly changed the topic by speaking of the hunt. And we shall close with that ending. Goodbye.